Hi everyone, my name is Heaven Gif Odal, and my topic for tonight is the types of augmented feedback. Augmented feedback is a means of supplementing the sources of the task's intrinsic feedback, normally available to the learner. The adjective augmented refers to adding to or enhancing something, which in this case involves adding to or enhancing the task's intrinsic feedback. Augmented feedback enhances the task's intrinsic feedback that involves information the person's sensory system that could readily detect on its own, though not necessarily reliably. It is classically broken down in two categories comprised of task intrinsic feedback and augmented feedback, the external or the artificial feedback. So when people perform a motor skill, they can have available to them two general types of performance-related information that will tell them something about the outcome of the performance or about what caused that outcome. One is the task intrinsic feedback, which is the sensory conceptual information that is natural part of performing a skill. Each of our sensory system can provide this type of feedback. For example, if a person throws a dart at the target on a wall, he or she receives visual task intrinsic feedback from seeing the flight of the dart and where it lands on the target. In addition, the person receives tactile and proprioceptive task intrinsic feedback from the head, trunk, and limbs as he or she prepares the executes the throw. Other sensory systems can also provide task intrinsic feedback, as does the auditory system when the person hears the dart hit or not hit the target. The second type of performance related information is an addition to task intrinsic feedback. Although various terms have been used to identify this type of feedback, this is the external feedback, task extrinsic feedback. The term that will be used in this topic is the augmented feedback. So for example, a teacher or a coach might tell a dancer where his or her hands were positioned at the top of the steps. So even though proprioceptive feedback would allow the person to feel for himself or herself where they were. Intrinsic feedback is considered information that of use to the learner and it's received across visual, auditory, tactile, and proprioceptive sensory inputs. So the task intrinsic feedback, the sensory feedback that is naturally available while performing a skill. And the augmented feedback, a generic term used to describe information about a performance that supplements sensory feedback and that comes from source external to the performer. It is sometimes referred to as extrinsic or external feedback. Note that the term feedback is common to the both categories of performance-related information that I've been described earlier. So as a result, it is important to consider the term feedback as a generic term that describes information people receive about their performance of a motor control skill during or after the performance. To help conceptualize the relationship between the two general types of performance-related feedback, consider these two types of feedback as related members of the same family. So, as you can see to the graph, describes the feedback family relationship of task intrinsic feedback and augmented feedback, as well as for the related specific types of each other. There are two categories of augmented feedback: the knowledge of performance or the KP and the knowledge of result or the KR feedback. The category of augmented feedback known as the knowledge of results, commonly referred to as KR, consists as externally presented information about the outcome of an attempt to perform a skill. In some situation, KR describes something about the performance outcome or the result. Sometimes, KR simply tells the performer whether he or she has achieved the performance goals. So, this is the case when some external device gives a yes or no signal indicating whether or not the performance goal was achieved. It is important to point out that we are using the term knowledge of result to refer to one type of augmented feedback. Although a person can obtain knowledge about the result of an action from his or her own sensory system, such as seeing whether the basketball missed the basket or went in. This type of performance-related information is task intrinsic. It does not refer to the specific type of performance-related information that the term knowledge of result to in this text. So, the importance of this distinction is that it allows us to distinguish the specific influences of task intrinsic and augmented feedback on the skill learning. Next is the knowledge of performance, the second category of augmented feedback. This is an information about the movement characteristic that led to the performance outcome. The important point here is that the knowledge of performance differs from the knowledge of result in terms of which aspect of performance the information refers to. In addition to giving the knowledge of performance verbally, there are various nonverbal means of providing knowledge of performance. For example, video replay is a popular method of showing a person what he or she did while performing a skill. Video replay also the person to see what he or she actually did that led to the outcome of the performance. Although video replay can show a performance outcome, it is commonly used as the knowledge of performance. This sensory feedback is augmented in a way that informs the person about the movement characteristics associated with the outcome of an action. So the knowledge of a result category of augmented that gives information about the outcome of an attempt to perform a skill, while the knowledge of performance category of the augmented feedback that gives information about the movement characteristics that led into performance outcome. Augmented feedback plays two roles in the skill learning process. So, one is to facilitate achievement of the action goal of the skill, because augmented feedback provides information about the success of the skill in the progress or just completed. The learner can determine whether what he or she is doing is appropriate for performing the skill correctly. Thus, the augmented feedback can help the person achieve the skill goal more quickly or more easily than he or she could without this external information. The second role played by augmented feedback is to motivate the learner to continue striving towards a goal. In this role, the person uses augmented feedback to compare his or her own performance to a performance goal. The person then must decide to continue trying to achieve that goal, to change that goal, or to stop performing the activity. We have here the practice schedule for augmented feedback, either the knowledge of results or the knowledge of performance, but we can do them in different schedules. We have here the continuous, faded, bandwidth, and summary feedback schedules. So let's start in the continuous feedback. Continuous is really just when the augmented feedback is given after every trial or just during the trials. So continuous feedback is when you're looking for later in learning stages. So once the person in the associative and especially autonomous stages of learning, you don't want to use continuous feedback. It could be okay in the initial stages where the person is a novice, but not once they get the past that. We want to actually taper off of the feedback as a person learns more and more. So the continuous is the generally feedback after every trial. So the next is faded feedback. The faded feedback is when the earlier stages of the motor learning is so the acquisition space has a high frequency of feedback, and then as a person learns it more and more, they kind of taper off with the feedback, and so you get the less and less feedback as the person gets more proficient of the motor scope. This is the called faded feedback schedule. The next is bandwidth feedback schedule. This is when feedback is only given if the errors are greater than a certain level. So in some cases, you can have minor errors. You know maybe that the minor errors is just the person just didn't get the dance step correctly. But maybe that person not getting the dance step because of their bad forms. So, and maybe that bad form could cause an injury or confusion. Well, that might be clearly above a threshold where you want to give feedback, so you would not give if it was just one failed attempt. If they had the proper form, they just messed up, right? But if they had really bad form that crosses the threshold, and then only for condition like that would give them the feedback. So if you only give the feedback when the errors are greater than a certain threshold, that would be a bandwidth schedule. So the last one is called summary schedule feedback. This is when the feedback is given for a group of trials. So if you just schedule the feedback where a person does 5 trials or something, and then you give the feedback, that would be the summary feedback. And one more thing, what effect does frequency of augmented feedback have on the performance and the retention of motor skill? This is a very important thing. High frequency of feedback, this might be what we see in the continuous feedback schedule. High feedback leads to greater performance in the moment. However, it does not necessarily facilitate retention. We want to taper off the feedback, and so we get to lower levels of the feedback. This tends to facilitate increased retention of the motor skill. So we don't want to keep that feedback continuous the whole time. We want to fade it. We want to taper it off gradually. Maybe we'll apply some bandwidth feedback there, but we point it as the person gets more proficient as they go to the associative and anatomous stages of the motor skill. We wanted to decrease the frequency of augmented feedback because that was going to facilitate long-term retention of the motor skill. Special consideration for the individual with neurological impairments. So, augmented feedback properly employed may have practical implications for rehabilitation therapy, since the reacquisition of motor skill is an important part of functional motor recovery. So, some patients with cognitive and perceptual impairments are not able to use intrinsic feedback to guide their performance. Furthermore, because their own abilities to generate intrinsic feedback may be compromised by neurological sensory impairments, they may be more dependent on the augmented feedback. So, augmented feedback provides strong justification to enhance motor learning and relearning across all ages and skill levels. In conclusion, augmented feedback is often provided to boost performance during skill acquisition. Providing augmented feedback during training improves performance, whereas the removal during a subsequent test or retention condition may result in performance deterioration. The most important feature of the information that must be given to the students or the athlete is the appropriateness of the augmented feedback. When augmented feedback is needed, the critical concern must be to determine 3 things: what information to give, how to give it, and how often to give it? The answer to this important question should be based on the knowledge of the skill being learned, the effect different types of augmented will have on learning that skill, and the characteristics of the individual learning the skill. The information must be appropriate for the skill being learned, the person learning the skill, and the learning situation. This information will help physical education teachers or coaches to meet the specific needs and the demands of the students or athletes during the motor learning practice, which in turn enhance performance during the learning or the competition. So that's all for tonight's discussion. I hope you learned something from me. Thank you!